All right, guys. Hey, we're back. Another Wednesday night study. We got Scout again. We're going through the 7 churches of Asia. Tonight, we're going to focus on Thyatira. But with some discussion, we had sort of talked about doing the whole thing. But after we got to looking, well, I think what we're going to do is we're probably going to break Thyatira up into 2 parts. We'll introduce the sort of main characters tonight. We'll talk about them, and then next Wednesday night we will sort of deal with the fallout of picking a side and what that means, and because there are some phrases, particularly towards the end of the chapter, that are going to cause us to stop and to pause a little bit to talk about them. So with that being said, I'm glad you guys are here. Really enjoyed Sunday getting to be together, and I told them, but just reiterate, man, it is so much more encouraging and exciting to preach in front of people than it is in front of empty pews,
That's right.
There's just something about being there and having that sort of feedback with one another that makes it, for me, more exciting. I think what happens is as a preacher, the more feedback you get visually and things like that, where you see people maybe nodding or taking notes or turning in their Bible, the more it encourages you. And so you want to, you get juiced up a little bit more. And that was just really nice to have. And I'd forgotten how great that is. And I really enjoyed that. And then probably, Scott, if you were like me, almost immediately the first song that we sang, I went, oh yeah, this is it. That's right. This is what I've been missing is hearing these voices together.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's look at Thyatira. The actual passage that encompasses all of it is verse 18 through 29 in Revelation chapter 2. We're just going to be talking about 18 through 21 tonight. Yep. So I'll read that, and then next week we'll get into 22 to the rest of the chapter. Okay, it says, "And to the angel of the church of Thyatira write, the words of the Son of God, whose eyes like a flame of fire, and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your works. I know your love and faith and service and patient endurance, and that your latter works exceed your first. But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent." Excuse me. "But she refused to repent of her sexual immorality." Okay, Scout, so tell me a little bit about Thyatira.
Well, it's going to be titled Tolerant Thyatira. And just to kind of give a recap on the ones we have studied, we've looked at estranged Ephesus, steadfast Smyrna, right, permissive Pergamos, and now we're there in Tolerant Thyatira.
Okay.
The reason we're going with that is because they are tolerating, it seems like, that woman Jezebel. We'll discuss that here in just a moment. But,
right.
We get into this. Obviously, this is the longest letter of the church here, and it's strange because the city of Thyatira is not necessarily that important, but there is a lot of background that we could cover going into it. We see it the first time mentioned is in Acts chapter 16. There's a woman there named Lydia, and this is where she's from. And so we don't really have a background of when the church was started or who started it, but it's probably a pretty good guess. It's not a hard fact, but to say that she went back after she was taught by Paul, took it back to her to Thyatira, and she probably helped establish a congregation there. So
right. Well, and I think that's a good way of saying that. Here is a strong probability, although we're not quite sure. Yep. But it seems like you could make an argument fairly easily and see how she might take from Philippi the message back to Thyatira and there start, sort of introducing the gospel. And like you said, it's not a really important city, especially compared to the other 7.
Very much so.
The 6 others that are here. One of the quotes I thought was interesting, William Barclay quoted a guy named Pliny, the elder, who was a Roman author and military commander in the 1st century. And he sort of talked about Thyatira. He says it's almost he calls it a contemptuous phrase, but it's dismissive, and he says Thyatira and other unimportant cities. So
Yeah.
as he's talking about all these unimportant cities, he uses Thyatira as the prime example of that. And so just kind of letting you know maybe the way the ancient world felt about Thyatira
Right.
as a city. It was a very small town compared to the other ones. And politically, it was insignificant. Religiously, it's insignificant. It doesn't have a large temple to a certain god or goddess or whatever that would bring people in. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't have
That's right.
the influence of idols there, because one of the things they do have for such a small town is it seems to be that they have just a massive amount of trades that would operate there. And so what happens is when you have a trade going on, a trade guild, they would all have their own little deity that would sort of be in charge of, bringing prosperity and, the technology or whatever to that particular trade. And so one of the things that we'll get into is because of that, they're going to bring worship of that trade. And so if you wanted to be a part of that trade, you had to be a part of that worship. And so, and like you said, Lydia is from there. Acts 16 mentions her as a seller of purple. And one of the things that they were most known for was this purple dye that was apparently, tough to get and tough to manufacture and things like that. And so it was seen as more rare and expensive and things like that. All right. The going back to this message here, it's almost a tale of two messages, where on one side God talks about the faithful. He talks to the faithful, and we'll look at that here in just a second and what that means. The other side, he talks to this false teacher, this Jezebel, and to her sort of followers and things like that. And so it's almost a two-sided thing here when you look at it. And what's interesting to me is even though you might talk about the trades and things like that, because I think that is going to come up and that's going to be important here in dealing with Jezebel. But as we talk about the trades and things like that, what we'll find is that I forgot my train of thought. Where was that?
Well, you're talking about the trade guilds and how they're gonna apply with this, especially with Jezebel, as we get into that of why she's saying, hey, it's okay to do this. You got to make a living.
Right.
This kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. It's okay. So whatever my brilliant thought was fixing to be, it is going to be an issue. I got it. I remember it now. It seems like even though they have these trade guilds that are going to factor into this equation, their real problem is not external.
Yeah, that's right.
Like many of the other congregations we're going to read about in the seven churches here, having a lot of external problems coming in and outside influences and stuff like that. The real problem is internal that they're going to deal with, and so that that's just something that's worth noting and important. Okay, you have anything else you want to discuss here in the setup? Or are you ready to kind of get into the text?
Just a quick thought right there.
Sure.
With the Thyatira being this unimportant city. It was, remember, Pergamus last week we discussed was more of a capital city of Asia. This was about 35 miles from that, and it was more of a border city garrison type where they'd get taken over from one side or the other, and then they would form to whichever for however long, whatever gods and stuff of the other country, and then a few years later the other country would come back and take them over. That's, I think, where you get this mixing pot of all of these false gods and the culture that's there. It's just It's crazy. But again, that'll lead into all these trade guilds that we're about to mention. So,
and again, there's an interesting thought there too, because it seems like the problems in the churches also have a little bit of mirror in the cities in which they live.
Yep.
Especially in look at these seven churches of Asia. Here you have a city that seems to be, a little bit of give and take in what they believe and what they, and
compromise.
That seems
tolerant.
Yeah, the tolerance of, and it seems to be that's the congregation has that same thing, and that happens again, and we'll see in later congregations. All right, so let's get into the text. There is an introduction here where we are introduced to the speaker, that is Jesus himself. He gives an introduction that is specific to Thyatira, and then he's going to talk to the faithful, and to Jezebel will be sort of our major players here. Okay, so let's get into this introduction, because we might almost skip over it if we're not careful, especially because of the visual descriptiveness of the second and third sort of descriptions of what Jesus is saying. But he starts here by saying he's the Son of God. Why is that significant?
Yeah, that's actually the only time that is found here is in Revelation chapter 2, verse number 18. And it seems to be that he is referencing himself as the summation of all of him, a total description of Christ, that he was, it was deemed necessary to put here because of all the issues that are going on in the church in Thyatira. There was a purpose for this, saying, look, I am the Son of God. There's everything that you need to be about is in me and nothing else.
Right. Now, we still do that today, where we, whose son is this, or, this is so-and-so's son, or something like that. But especially back then, that title, son of something, really meant you sort of shared the qualities or characteristics of that thing. And so a couple of examples, Isaiah 57, there's a reference to the son of sorcerers, sort of you're kind of like them, or maybe even go to Mark 3, where he talks about the sons of thunder.
Yep.
And then I thought about John 8 in verse 44, where he says, your father, the devil. Same kind of thing, not the exact same wording, but the same thought is, and that is you share
the qualities,
whatever this quality or characteristic of this thing is, because you're the son. And so to be the Son of God is a declaration of his divine nature. He shares everything about the nature of God, the true and living God, which again, separates him from the other deities that are around. What is it that makes Jesus who he is? And that is, he is the Son of God. He shares all the attributes of deity fully, and because of that, that does make him different from all these others that they would chase around. And so it's a great declaration, and it doesn't leave any doubt who's speaking. If we had to guess with these other ones who this is talking, Jesus leaves no doubt by saying, listen, I am the Son of God. Yeah. So he has a description, eyes like fire, which is also a quote or an allusion to one that he had used in the previous chapter, in chapter 114.
Yep.
He's described about that. So give me some hints on what that means. What is it? Eyes like fire.
Well, in studying this, you look through and you go, okay, fire is a cleansing thing. It can do a lot of different. It has a lot of different qualities, but Christ having these eyes like a flame of fire, it's piercing. He sees through everything. He knows. He's said in every introduction here, I know your works, and then he continues on with the list. And it's interesting here as they go through, and we'll get into verse number 19, but not to jump too far forward, as he's going to see everything that's going on internally, but also externally. And as you mentioned just a moment ago, a lot of what's going on here seems to be internal. That's what they're dealing with here. And he's telling the congregation and those he's writing to, saying, I see what's going on, and I'm gonna give you the options here. And there's a solution, and then, like you said, it's the two tails, right? Here's the faithful. Here's those who decide to follow Jezebel. So he's going to know everything that's going on.
Right. There was one writer who said it presents his eyes as looking with penetrating justice, and I kind of like that phrase there. But yeah, fire is not only powerful, because we think about the power of fire, but also it can be purifying. Things that are metals, especially, and things like that are made pure and refined, or it's done through heat and fire and that kind of thing. And so eyes of fire, this idea that he sees, and that it is both a powerful and a pure sight by which he sort of sees these things is important. And then he says feet like brass, which also comes from chapter 1, but instead of verse 14, it's in verse 15. And feet are, it can be symbolic of seveal things. One I thought about is it could symbolize experience. So we use phrases today. Yeah, boots on the ground means that you were there and you experienced it. And it wasn't just hearsay, you were actually a part of it. Or we might say, hey, walk a mile in that guy's shoes, kind of thing. You take your feet, use it as he would. And so sometimes we use it that way. Sometimes we use it as a foundation, like set your feet, that kind of thing. And then I was also thought there's a fallacy called a slippery slope, where the idea is that your logic it's not solid. It starts at something small and eventually grows into something that's way out of proportion, and your logic falls apart at some point. And so you're standing on a slippery slope that you're going to slide down. And so, if you take both of those and you apply it to this description, experience and having a solid foundation, he's unmovable, he's strong, he knows what he's talking about. All of those things might be included. And then he has in here the idea that it was made out of brass, purified brass, which for them was the strongest metal element that it's not an element, but the strongest metal that they could come up with. They're in the, making things out of brass is a big deal. Now, of course, I've already spoiled this for Scout, but the strongest metal that we know of today is called chromium. Certainly there are other metals that God could have used to describe strength, but to them and to their mind, brass is the best example, right? Okay, so it gives this description of himself. He's the Son of God. He has eyes that can see what's going on, that can penetrate and do so. And he presents himself as standing firmly and purely here before them. And so what we might say is this presentation, number one, shows not only that he is God, he is deity, but also that his judgment is true. He has the ability to see and he has the ability to stand. And so what he's saying to them is that which is true. So he says he knows what's going on in Thyatira, and that's an important phrase because Thyatira is the least known city in all of these examples, and yet Jesus still knows about them.
Yep.
And he's still aware of them. And so maybe there's a point to be made in that, is that even though they were insignificant in the eyes of many people, to Christ they weren't. He had full knowledge of them. And so he says, I know your works, and he lists them off: love, service, faith, patience. And just stop for a moment. Let's look at this, because I think it's worth looking at. Love is the word agape, so it's that sort of sacrificial love, that putting others first kind of thing. And a lot of times we think of love in positive traits. But when you go and you look at 1 Corinthians 13, not only are there positive traits there, there's also negative traits there. Yep. In other words, it's not just love is patient, love is kind. Here's also things that love is not. It's not envious. It doesn't boast. It's not arrogant and rude. It's not all of those things that it lists there in verses 4 through 6. Thyatira doesn't have any of those. If Thyatira is a place where there's love, it not only has all the things that we would consider as positive traits, but it also doesn't have any of those negative traits that would negate that love. And so it is a place where it's not prideful. It's not a place of boasting, or they have humility and things like that. But they're also a serving congregation. The Greek word there is dekakonia, and it's the word ministry. And I think about Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10, where his workmanship created in Christ for good works. Yep. We're all created for good works, and they were doing that. They were part of that. And it goes on to mention their faith, that it's strong. And so apparently they have no, whatever is going on, there doesn't seem to be, for the faithful at least, a conflict about who God is. They know who is God, and they know who God is, and they're firm in that. And then it also their patience, constant steadfastness. They're not falling back in what they're doing, and that's made even greater by this second declaration he has about their works, and that is that they're more than the first. What does that mean?
Well, in my mind, it first pops out as contrast to that of Ephesus. It seems like Ephesus seemed to have stopped growing in a certain aspect of things, but here it seems that not only are you doing these good works, you're continuing to do these good works. You're striving towards that perfection that we mentioned before. But
Right.
that it's an always increasing thing. These guys seem to be doing pretty good, but that's going to take a turn here in just a moment. But the way that they're being commended right now is good. I have you mentioned Ephesians chapter 2 there, but I have that they were spiritually ministering, Ephesians 4 verse number 12 also, and then 2 Timothy 3 verse number 17, we're equipped for every good work there. It seems that their works are just abounding in what they're doing. It seems that they are growing spiritually and physically with one another there, and that's a good thing. That's what they need to be doing.
Right. It's not a congregation that's stuck in neutral.
Yeah.
They're growing in their love and service and faith and patience, and they're increasing as they go in their measure of those things. And yeah, like you said, if we just stop the passage here, our tower's doing great, right? Yeah. Like if you left the room as they were reading this, and this is all you heard, you're thinking, hey man, we're doing great. However, there is the word nevertheless.
Yeah.
So he's told them all of this, all these great things, and then this word nevertheless comes into it. And nevertheless is a way of saying,
but
yeah, and this is good. However, those things don't overshadow this
they don't
thing.
Negate it. We mentioned that quite a few times in our previous studies. All the wrongs in the world don't make, or all the rights in the world don't make a wrong right. So
that's right. Yeah. Even though you've got all this going for you, we still have to address this thing, and this has to be taken care of. And that kind of introduces us into our third character here, our third individual into this particular passage. And it's a woman named, or he at least calls her Jezebel. And so he says, you tolerate, some versions say suffer, some say permit. That woman, Jezebel, one of the great definitions I found was for that word was that they were letting her teach whatever she wanted to. And so the definition was that they should allow to do as she wished. They left her alone.
Yeah.
So she's doing her thing, and they just sort of stand back and let it happen.
Yeah, it didn't seem that there was opposition to her. Right.
And when you think about it, maybe there's a couple of reasons for this. And again, this is all conjecture, but think about it. One side, maybe she's overbearing. Maybe she's hard to deal with, and no one wants to deal with her. You know what I mean? There are people like that who are just confrontational, and if you challenge them, it is over the top in their response, and it's just not worth dealing with. You know what I mean? And maybe in a spiritual way that they had come to that conclusion. Like every time we try to say something, it's just, and well, I just don't want to deal with it. And so people, maybe they're afraid of her. Another reason, maybe they're afraid of what it's going to do to the congregation. And again, there are congregations who have allowed things to go on for that very reason. They don't want to split the congregation. And I will say this, I've never been a part of a congregation that split, but I know people who have, and it is a terrible thing. It is a hard thing. No one who has ever gone through it probably looks back and goes, man, I'm glad we did that. Like that was really enjoyable. It's always a heartbreaking thing. And I've always said that when brethren fight so much that they split, the only winner is Satan, and so maybe they were afraid of that. Maybe they're afraid, oh, this is going to cause a split. And so they just didn't deal with it because they feared the consequences of it. Um, and then maybe some of it comes from the fact that she doesn't seem to be encroaching on their practice.
Yeah.
And so they have sort of that live and let live kind of, this isn't really affecting me.
Yeah.
So I'll just let them do their thing. And, maybe that, and that goes in with that tolerant Thyatira kind of thing, is that, hey, they're just letting her do her thing over there.
Yeah.
Now he does use this name Jezebel, which is one of those notorious names. Of course, 1 Kings 16 through 21, 2 Kings chapter 9, you find some of the stories of Jezebel, and she is arguably, I think, the most wicked woman in all of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know that there would be many who would disagree with that. Certainly her name has a reputation. The fact that we immediately, when we hear her name, we think of that. We think of her wickedness, and
that's right.
So of course, we always think about names: Benedict Arnold, Judas, Hitler, things like that. And Scout has a little girl. You didn't name her Jezebel.
No.
So there's probably a reason behind that. I'm not sure how much.
It was. We tossed it up, but really
right.
Yeah. Decided not to. Yeah.
Right. I was going to say, I don't know how much thought you gave it, but most of the time, because of who Jezebel is and what's associated with the name,
yep.
It doesn't get used.
Yeah.
And
think about
go ahead, man.
You think about it in 2 Kings 9, verse number 22, how everything is summed up, her sins. It's considered in two things there: harlotry and witchcraft.
Yeah.
That's how she was summed up as a whole. So.
Yeah. So like I said, she's the name there, and I think we both sort of agree that that's probably not her real name.
Yeah.
That Jesus is using this name here to describe her character, and to describe her wickedness.
Something that just kind of stood out to me from what we talked about earlier was the way he introduced himself, the Son of God. He's correlated with God, maybe the same way here. The characteristics this woman is portraying is characteristics of what Jezebel would have been.
Right. Yeah. I think that's probably
off the top of my head.
No, that's good. That's good. She doesn't call herself Jezebel.
Yeah, that's right. That woman.
She calls herself a prophetess. And I think there's a phrase in there that's important, is that God's not saying I'm calling her a prophetess. She's calling herself this.
That's right.
This is a self-applied title. And Matthew 24:11 talks about the false prophets that are going to come. And then immediately I thought of like 1 John 4:1, test the spirits. Don't believe every spirit. And yet here she's calling herself a prophetess, and they're kind of like going, oh, okay, sure. And letting her have it.
Yeah.
Which, I think is unfortunate for them. But Jesus also, in calling her, giving her this name and showing that she's calling herself a prophetess, shows you what he really thinks of her.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, sharing in that sort of quality or characteristic of Jezebel and the nature of Jezebel, but also making the point is, I came from God, she didn't. This is, she's not a God authorized prophet by any sense of the word or anything like that. This is something that she's put upon herself. Is an important differentiation, I think. All right, and so he says that she had seduced them, and so I had on here sort of a breakdown that her name was Jezebel, her title is prophetess, and her method is seduction. And most of the time, if someone uses the word seduction, immediately think of sort of the corporeal activities of seducing something. And that certainly is going to apply here.
Yeah.
You think about the physical and things like that, but seduction itself as a word, when you go and look it up, it means not to call someone towards something, but to lead someone away from something.
Mm.
And so when you're saying, well, being seduced, the idea there's not necessarily that you're calling someone towards that physical temptation, but you're calling them away from wherever they were before that. In
Yeah.
this particular case, righteousness. And so she's calling them not only to fornication and the sacrificing of meats, but also it's worth noting in doing so, she's calling them away from the truth.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So, like, you might ask the question, well, how does this happen? And again, we're speculating here. How do you let a congregation where you have such a great description also have this woman named Jezebel, and what she's teaching is clearly, I think we all agree, is seen as wrong, blatantly wrong. How does that happen? And it reminds me, number one, of the power of sort of manipulation. People can, if they want to, be manipulated, and you can take any series of facts and sort of draw your own picture to get to a particular place. And that's certainly true in the Bible and in other places in life. And so one of the things I thought about was, Paul does teach the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 10. He asked the question, food offered to idols, is it anything? Is that idol anything? And his argument is no. And so maybe she's taking it and she's going, well, listen, if Paul says this is nothing, it's no big deal, then it's no big deal. We could go down there and partake in all of this, and we're not offending anything. Now, what she would have lacked was 20 through 22, where he's saying, stay away from it.
That's right.
Even though it's not anything, don't practice it, don't have any part of it. But maybe she's using sort of that idea, and I mean, maybe even twisting it around to say, listen, by going out and being a part of these things, you're in the community, you're making, that you're actually doing a good thing.
Yeah.
By going.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. We're saying.
It just kind of goes along with how close do you want to get to it, right?
Right.
How close can I get without really committing a sin, or however you want to look at it?
Right.
I would say that she probably had a pretty warm reception from the guilds, in my opinion. Like, hey, I think this is all right. And I think this guy is going to keep working for you because I think he's going to be on the same page as us now. I think.
Right. Well, and two, I think there is in this the idea that this was going to affect them financially.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so.
And to be honest with you, faith often gets challenged for a lot of people when it meets the pocketbook.
Yeah.
We used to joke about people getting baptized and leaving their wallet when they change clothes. They leave their wallet in the changing room, and they go get baptized, and they don't realize that their wallet actually symbolically goes with them. And maybe get the idea of someone holding their wallet up above the water as they're going down. But when you look at the idea of, is my family going to get to eat? Am I going to have my livelihood? The things that I'm accustomed to and stuff like that, is that going to be challenged? Well, all of a sudden, that could open up for a world of tolerance and justifications and things like that. And maybe that's what's going on here. Is that they're going to benefit financially from having these associations with these trades and these trade guilds and things like that. And so, if someone comes in and all of a sudden goes, hey, you can actually be a part of that.
Yeah.
Well, now all of a sudden maybe they're listening and they're interested.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
they're trying to get the best of both worlds, right?
Right. And like one of the things too that I have noticed over the years, and again, this is me thinking off the top of my head. God is very specific about his rules for marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And some of the hardest conversations I've ever had, and this comes from having to go through them, is having discussions with people who are in those situations where they have all of a sudden they either want to marry someone they're not allowed to, that it's not authorized, or they're already married to someone that they weren't supposed to marry. And to have to tell them that is tough. And then when you add to that the idea of, hey, you can go right down the street and there's a guy who will tell you you're completely fine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there are people who will tell you, yeah, don't worry about that. And they actually have complete disregard for the structure that God set up for this situation. I could see the appeal of why someone might take that. Because when you're talking about tough decisions that affect family and relationships and, livelihoods and things like that, to have someone come in and go, oh, yeah, you don't have to sacrifice any of those things.
Yeah.
Man,
Okay.
I could see why people would listen.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what gives Jezebel sort of this foot in the door, is that she is, and it is powerful. And so, she seems to be encouraging them to be a part of that, to be a part of the guild, and to go to their feasts and other things that go on. And part of that would also be, they would have, as part of these celebrations, they would have fertility sort of rites that go on. And many times that would involve temple prostitutes and things like that, and going and having a physical relationship with a temple prostitute and things like that. And so he says, listen, this is what you've introduced. And then, kind of one of the things I think that's also important is that he uses this phrase, she has, let me make sure I read it correctly. Okay, he says, she has been teaching and seducing my servants to practice immorality, which, again, that's a possessive phrase. These are my people. They're not yours, Jezebel. You don't get to take them away from me, and I'm going to be okay with it. They're mine. And so she had corrupted not only these individuals, but she corrupted servants of Jesus. She had people who belonged to him, and he wasn't going to stand for it.
Sure.
All right, you got anything you want to add to that, or we'll move on to the...
Well, just looking real quick at Ephesians chapter 5, verse number 11, just kind of along that line is, a Christian not only can a Christian not have any fellowship with unfruitful works of darkness, but they have to reprove them too.
Right.
Which it seems, again, they're not, whatever's going on internally, they're not taking the proper steps to say, hey, we have to mitigate this. This has to be taken care of. So that's kind of popped into my mind there.
Right. Okay, so kind of wrapping up here, as you look at the last part of it, he talks about her refusal. So we've seen her name, her title, her methods of seduction, and now this is her refusal. God said, I gave her time to repent.
Yeah, he's patient with her.
But she didn't. And I think that's an important thing. He was patient with her. Listen, I gave you time to do this. So apparently she's not ignorant of this thing. She knows that what she's doing is wrong.
Yep.
However, it has been given to her, this message. She has received the message from God. I am not pleased.
Yep.
You need to stop this. And even though she heard it and received it, she chose not to do it. She refused to give up these practices.
Not only was she refusing, she seemed to be pulling those others along with her. She was trying to bring everyone down on that sinking ship, if you will.
Right. So this is not just, in my mind, a sin of ignorance. In other words, she can't stand here and go, oh, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Because this phrase tells us, no, she did. God told her that you're not supposed to be doing this, and yet she continues to do it. Yep. And I think there's a lesson in there about God's patience, that God was patient enough to give her this time. But also, it reminds me that God does give all of us time to repent, but that time is not.
There's a limited time.
Unlimited. There's a limit to that. And Ephesians 5:16, redeem the time.
Yep.
You've got to take those opportunities as you're given to them, because at some point that time limit runs out.
Yep.
And we have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the things that we're doing. Okay, so here's what we have so far as we're going through it. We have a congregation that is small, but seems to be heavily influenced in trade guilds. And Jesus comes to them, proclaims himself to be the Son of God with pure judgment and a pure standing in front of them. There are some who are faithful, and they have been growing in their faith, and they are continuing to grow in that faith. And then you have, on the other side, you have Jezebel and her followers, who have been the ones who have compromised and have chosen willfully to sin against God. And the problem is that first group had tolerated the second group.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what we'll do is we'll leave it at that for this week. That brings us to verse 22. Next week we will finish that, and there are some phrases in the next part that are very colorful. And take a moment to pause and talk about, because he talks about killing children in this, and there's a reference to a morning star and all of that. And so, again, those are things that we talked about this earlier. We didn't want to sort of skip over those things. We didn't want to rush through them. We wanted to take some time with it. And so what we'll do is next week, we will talk about the second part of Thyatira and sort of wrap this up. And so what we thought, again, is this first week we'll introduce the characters. In the second week, we'll talk about the implications and the applications of what's going on and the choices that they have to make. So, okay, Scout, brother, as always, you did great, and I'm enjoying this. And I can think back to years ago when you were just a little rugrat running around with your friends and your buddies at camp, and getting all kinds of stuff. And so to be able to be here and to see and to experience sitting down and not dealing with you as a little kid, but as a peer,
just a big rugrat.
Yeah, it's a big blessing to me, man. And I want you to know
I appreciate it.
How proud I am of you, and we'll be praying for you in the work there, and ask that you do the same for us. And I look forward to talking about Thyatira again next week. So,
yes, sir.
You got anything else you want to say, or are you ready to?
Nope. I'm hoping these are benefiting everyone. It's been good to go back through this study, and hopefully we'll get to come down there soon, and maybe Patrick will let me use that pulpit every once in a while.
Hey, be careful, man. Be careful. Yeah, we'd love to have you, dude. Just let me know. Okay, that's it. We'll see you guys Sunday, and we'll continue this for next week. Until then, guys, stay safe. Keep up the diligent efforts and taking care of this weird situation that we have going on. And love you guys. All right.